Greetings, Rabbi Griscott here with your sermon recap for yesterday's Parsha Ki Teitzei. I remember a moving incident in my previous shul when there was an 80-year-old man who was a member of the shul and his mother passed away at the age of 102. So it's not often that you see an 80-year-old person in mourning for a parent. But he said at the funeral he was very moved. His father had passed away decades earlier. And he turned to me and he said, "I'm a yasom. Now I'm an orphan." And that really struck me. Usually when we hear the term orphan, we think of Charles Dickens, Oliver Twist, a Dickens novel with a young boy with a dirty face and a cap in an orphanage. The term usually refers to a child who is bereft of his parents. But is it the case that the vast majority of older people, as it should be, as the course of nature, will not have their parents at a certain point? Are those people considered to be orphans? I haven't actually looked up the word in the dictionary. Probably should have before I gave the speech. Perhaps I prefer to live with the mystery of it, but I'm not sure what the exact definition is. But this issue actually comes up in the Parsha yesterday, where the Torah constantly returns to this triad of people, these three different classes of people who require extra mercy. Lo satem mishpat ger yasom, v'lo sachbol beged almana. וזכרת כי עבד היית במצרים ויבטח השם אלוקיך משם על כן אנוכי מצווך לעשות את הדבר הזה. So towards the beginning of the seventh, the final aliyah, you shall not pervert the judgment of a stranger or orphan, and you shall not take the garment of a widow as a pledge. So the stranger, the orphan, and the widow. The stranger, the Talmud says, the ultimate manifestation of the stranger in our midst is the convert. We have to be extra sensitive to the convert, to treat them as part of our family and not as an outsider. Then there's the widow and the orphan. Well, presumably this is a financial issue because back in the day, a woman couldn't make money without a husband. Women couldn't make money independently. So a woman who doesn't have a husband is probably poor and needs our help. And so too with an orphan, with the assumption being we're talking about a child orphan who doesn't have his parents and also has no means of support. So we have to be extra careful to financially support these people. And the Torah goes on, when you reap your harvest in your field and you forget a bundle in the field, you shall not turn back to take it. It shall be for the stranger, the orphan, and the widow, so that Hashem your God will bless you in all your handiwork. Right? You're reaping your harvest. You drop some produce. Leave it so that these three people can come get it. And presumably the stranger, the convert, also might be financially in need. They don't have family to support them. Back in the day, they might have left their homeland and come to the land of Israel to be part of the Jewish people, and they're kind of alone, like an immigrant nowadays. They're probably more in financial need. They're not as tied into the system. And when you beat your olive tree, do not remove all the splendor behind you. It shall be for the stranger, the orphan, and the widow. When you harvest your vineyard, you shall not glean behind you. It shall be for the stranger, the orphan, and the widow. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and therefore I command you to do this thing. But the Talmud has a vigorous discussion on the issue of darshinan taima dekra. Are we permissible to infer the underlying reason for a mitzvah, for a commandment, and then to apply that reason? Right? We could use our seichel, we could use our brain and understand why is the Torah commanding us this. And the classic example is the orphan and the widow. The Talmud asks, what about a widow who's a multimillionaire? That happens more nowadays than it did back then. But do you still have to be extra kind to the widow? So here an example is given, don't take her garment as a pledge. You could picture a widow who has one nice dress. Historically, we have so much clothes nowadays, we don't think about this. But historically, you had your one nice suit, your one nice dress. You give a loan to a poor widow. Don't take her one nice dress as the collateral for that loan. That's a cruel thing to do. That's the example the Torah gives. This extra consideration, does it apply to financially well-off widows? Or do you say, no, this is actually an emotional underlying concern? It doesn't matter if the widow is wealthy. She lost her husband. She is someone who is emotionally in need, and even if she's a multi-millionaire, you have to be extra kind to her. As I mentioned, what's the age cutoff for an orphan? If someone's 17 in our society, he's still a minor, but you can imagine a 17-year-old whose parents left him millions of dollars and perhaps isn't as worthy as extra kindness and consideration. And the same thing for a convert or a stranger who really is well-to-do and doesn't need our support. So are we entitled to say the Torah didn't mean it, this rich widow doesn't really need extra help? The conclusion of the Talmudic discussion is we are not, in fact, entitled to infer the reason for the mitzvahs. We're allowed to discuss it theoretically. We sit around for hours in the base medrash and the academic setting, and rabbis can talk about the underlying reason. But in the end of the day, divine law is divine law, and it's dangerous to try to say it doesn't apply here, it does here. That was one of the original disputes between the Orthodox and Reform. Some early Reform rabbis looked at the laws of kosher and they said, well, what's really underlying this is a concern for health, and so it's the way to apply kosher nowadays is just eat healthy and don't eat not healthy. It doesn't matter to keep the laws as they were originally given. And the Orthodox said, we don't get into the reasons and applying the reasons. We just keep divine law blindly out of faith. And it's dangerous to sort of pull on that thread. So it's easy to sort of scoff at the idea of what a widow who's rich still needs compassion because she's bereaved. It does appear to be financial in the verses, right? One thing this pandemic has brought out, I think, and all my sermons have been coming back to reading the Torah in light of the unprecedented time that we're in historically, is that there really are two levels of suffering right now. There are plenty of people financially suffering, but what doesn't get as much play is the emotional and mental health toll that this pandemic has taken. First, from the lockdowns and people being isolated and not being able to go anywhere, especially elderly people who are stuck in old age homes where people aren't even allowed to visit. And they're not so savvy with using Zoom and computers, and the only way to keep in touch is the telephone. Thank God for the telephone. But if anything, these discussions in the Parsha about the distinction between financial need and emotional need should teach us that perhaps it's a false dichotomy in the first place, and the wisdom of the Talmud to understand that you can't start distinguishing so neatly between financial and emotional need. They're both incredibly compelling levels of need, and one is not necessarily greater than the other. I'm reminded also of another incident in my former shul, where we used to be able to get up on Friday night. In the beginning, when I first got there, we would announce a beautiful custom. If anyone needs a place for a Shabbos meal, please let us know and we'll set you up. We were able to set people up on the spot, primarily because we had these two families that were very generous that has standing invitation to host any guest on Friday night. In New York, there are a lot of people, a lot of tourists always passing through. Eventually, we had to discontinue that offer because these two families moved out to the suburbs and we weren't really able to say with certainty that we'd be able to find a host volunteer on the spot. Of course, we still set up people in advance if they asked in advance. But in any case, there was one man who would take me up on this offer every single Friday night. I'd like to be hosted for a Shabbos meal. And I got concerned that maybe the hosts are going to be overburdened by having to take this guy every week. I thought maybe he was taking advantage. Finally, one time I told him, listen, I'd be happy to write you a check and you can buy some Shabbos meals from the kosher supermarket, kosher marketplace, which that was the name of the place, the kosher marketplace. And he was offended, and I'll never forget this because I felt guilty about it. He said, Rabbi, I don't need the money and I don't need the food. I actually have a very good job. I'm well to do. I ask because I need the company. I'm a single guy. I live alone and I'm lonely. And then we kind of had a real discussion about it. And he said, okay, I understand every week is too much, maybe every second week. And I said, fine. But that kind of stung me that I condescended to him that way. And it taught me an important lesson about emotional need versus financial need. It also reminded me of a lesson of Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik on the classic expression we say in the Pesach Seder. Let everyone who is needy come and eat. It's let everyone who is hungry come and eat. Let everyone who is in need come and celebrate the Pesach. Rabbi Soloveitchik asks, why do we say it twice in this double way? He says, let everyone who is hungry come and eat refers to literal financial need. They don't have enough food. But the second part, let everyone who is in need come and celebrate the Pesach, refers to emotional need. Those who need the Seder, not because they don't have matzah and wine at home. They don't want to be alone for the Seder. They want to be with people, understandably, as they're supposed to be. And it's that level of need that the Seder addresses with the second half of that statement. I think the lesson for us during the pandemic is we need to stay connected, reach out to those who might be isolated in ways we never maybe did before, but it should wake us up to reach out now. And also in terms of our own personal, emotional, and mental health we might be suffering, and make sure to reach out and stay connected for our own sake as well. And with that, I wish everyone a Shavua Tov.